All right, so we are going to look at chapter 19, which is section 1 through section 3, and it is on the kind of the Darwinian basis of evolution, so descent with modification. So really this chapter is just a introduction to evolution. Most of this is kind of reviewing that you've probably have heard or already worked with most of these concepts before, things like natural selection, descent with modification already. And it's just kind of sort of, like I said, an introduction to this material that we're going to look at in the next 3 or so chapters in evolution. And descent with modification is kind of the crux of evolution as far as Darwinian evolution goes, and so that's what we're going to be looking at today. But the first thing we really need to know to appreciate what modern evolutionary, or at least Darwinian evolutionary theory says, is to understand kind of the ideas about how organisms changed, or how all the life forms on Earth developed that were around before Darwin's idea, before The Origin of Species was published, because those ideas are going to be extremely important in finally formulating Darwinian evolution. So the groundwork, meaning the basis for Darwin's Origin of Species, for Darwinian evolution, is rooted in really work that existed even before he was born. So this idea that organisms change over time wasn't a given. It wasn't something that was 100% accepted at the time Darwin was around. Interestingly enough, the ancient Greeks were the kind of first in written history to suggest that life gradually changes over time. But the scientific community at the time of Darwin, when he was born, was kind of split. There were many who felt like organisms don't change over time, that the different fossils that were found in the ground represented mass extinctions. Every layer in between, or every layer where you find different fossils, well, why are there different fossils in the layer above? Well, because the layer below, all of the species that are represented by fossils, they died out in some mass extinction and then got repopulated by new species from a different area. And this idea that organisms, that life changed over time, didn't sit very well for those people who, for the religious community, and most of science was still in compliance with the Old Testament. So the Greeks kind of first postulated this idea that life could gradually change over time, which is going to be extremely important to Darwinian evolution. And Linnaeus actually created the taxonomic classification we have now, with the genus and the species and, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, that stuff. And they were based on structural similarities, so physical similarities between organisms and matching their relatedness by structural similarity. A geologist called Lyell, who wrote Principles of Geology, a really important book, popularized the idea of gradualism. So gradualism means that geological processes are continually occurring at a slow rate, and they cause the geological features on the Earth. So things like the Grand Canyon is gradually created by the constant churning and eroding from the Colorado River. Gradual change over time. And some biologists began to grab onto that and was like, well, we think the same process of gradualism is occurring in biology. And lastly, really the study of fossils and paleontology was at a boom before Darwin was born. And there was a huge study about how the morphology changed between different layers in the ground. And, relative dating was a thing where organisms or fossils found deeper in the earth are older than fossils found more closer to the Earth's surface. And scientists, the first paleontologists, really began to see how older fossils had different morphologies and were far less complex than newer or more recent fossils in the rock strata. Probably the most popular theory, or let's just say the theory of the origin of different species before Darwin's book was published, was that of use and disuse by Lamarck. So most ideas about how organisms changed were bounded by religion. They had a huge influence. So Lamarck proposed the theory of use and disuse. This pretty much stated that if an organism uses a specific body part more frequently, then it becomes bigger and stronger. So a good example was like Lamarck's giraffe, or his theory of why giraffes have long necks. Original giraffes had short necks, and after those original giraffes, or one giraffe that was around a long time ago, kept trying to stretch its neck up and eat plants, that act of stretching its neck made it longer, and it could pass on that mutation, that change, to the next generation who had a slightly longer neck. And if they continued to stretch their neck up to eat leaves, they would pass that on to the next, and over time the necks would get longer from repeated use. So big thing is he thought that using a part made it bigger and stronger, and that those acquired changes could be passed on. Lamarck also thought that evolution happened because there was some sort of innate drive to complexity. Well, we know now those ideas were altogether incorrect. Lamarck was very important because he did recognize that there was a match of an organism's structure to its environment. The giraffe was suited for the environment that it lived in. That slow and gradual cumulative change resulted in the difference between species and adaptations, and that inheritance was extremely important. Genetic inheritance was extremely important in acquiring these different traits. So then Darwin was born, and Darwin was an English naturalist. He originally didn't know what he was going to do, went to medical school, and was horrified by the surgeries that were done without anesthesia, just couldn't take it. So he became a naturalist instead. He just loved studying nature and collecting samples. And when he was about 25 years old, he got an awesome opportunity to be the naturalist on a surveying ship called the HMS Beagle. It was going to sail around the world and specifically map unknown regions, particularly the coast of South America. And he jumped at this chance because he could study and collect thousands of plants and animals from all over the world, from the Galapagos, from South America, from Africa, from islands in Oceania. And one thing that he was surprised at were the similarities between organisms between different locations that he visited, and the similarities between fossils that he found and living organisms. One really important thing species he noted were in the islands of the Galapagos, there were different finch populations, and they looked very similar but had slight differences. And these differences were kind of constrained to were related to what island the finches were on. So each of these different finch species were found on a different island. On a different island, he noticed how similar they were. And that their differences in for example, for beak shape and structure, had to do a lot about what they ate. So that these finches were very adapted to their environment, to the resources that were found in their environment, and to where they had to live. And he postulated these differences arose because these organisms were found in different environments. And he really made a tenet of his research that adaptation was especially important for animal survival. And he saw, after reading Lyell's Principles of Geology, the geological phenomena in fossils in the different strata that supported a theory that, biology was changing gradually just like in geology. So he got back from his voyage and was looking over all of his research, and it was becoming clear that Lamarckian evolution wasn't correct. And he developed kind of the cornerstone to explain his change, what was causing this change over time, and he called that natural selection. Natural selection. Now, artificial selection was very common in those times. Crop farmers, agriculturalists were breeding, especially plants that had desired traits, so they would be more virile and they would produce more crop. And Darwin thought, well, maybe the same manipulated selection we're doing is happening, except man is not going to be the driver. The driver of natural selection is that individuals that have a certain trait, inherited trait, may tend to survive and reproduce more because of those traits in the environment. So, if an organism has a genetic trait that allows them to survive better than those without that trait in the environment, they will most likely live longer and reproduce more because of it, and therefore the offspring they have will also be able better to survive. That is what kind of natural selection is, and it is what drives descent with modification. That all life descended from past ancestors, and that natural selection is the driver that those modifications begin to slowly accumulate via over time. One of the big examples he used is the modern elephant. The modern elephant in Asia and Africa, and the mammoths that were extinct at the end of the last ice age, are different species that all share a common ancestor to 37 million years ago. And over time, as the ancestral species migrated and adapted through natural selection to different conditions, it diverged into many different species. And the elephants of Asia eventually diverged into the Asian elephant variety and the African species, adapting to those situations there, accumulated traits that allowed them to survive in Africa, and diverged in the African elephant species. So, in general, there are 4 things that Darwin uses the basis of evolution. 1, members of population vary in their inherited traits. Not every member of a population have the same genetic traits. Then he said that there is a competition for survival and for resources among organisms that live in the same area. For shelter, for food, for water, for protection, there's a competition. And that some individuals will inherently be better able to compete, to survive in their environment, to reproduce, because of those genetic traits and those morphological attributes those traits give them. And so, that unequal ability to survive will lead to more of those beneficial traits being in the gene pool than next generation. And that is what evolution is. At its very basis, microevolution is that there is a change in allele frequency of a population over time. It doesn't have to be a morphology, doesn't have to be something visible or even beneficial, but any change statistically significant change in the frequency of different genes of alleles in a population as time progresses is evolution. And the main driver is natural selection via mutation. So mutation is the big cause of genetic variation outside of meiotic and sexual recombination. Mutations create genetic variation to allow natural selection to work upon. So there's vast and diverse scientific supports for evolution. One, we can directly observe evolution. So, antibiotic resistance, we can observe as time goes on, especially since the 80s, the increase in resistant bacteria to antibiotics, different strains, as we use those antibiotics. And the same thing with our transformation experiment we just did, we can see that carried out in one class period. In Florida, we can see the evolution of the soapberry bug. So, the soapberry bug feeds on a plant that has a large fruit balloon plant. And historically, this balloon plant on a golden rain tree was very large, and so the insects, the soapberry bugs that fed on this large, thick-skinned golden rain tree fruit had to have very long beaks that could pierce through it and get the juicy nutrients on the inside. And so, on average, they had long beak lengths. Well, later on, more recently, kind of in central Florida, a balloon vine plant with a much more deflated fruit was introduced. And when studying the soapberry bugs that are living on central Florida feeding on the balloon vine, you can see their beaks have become, on average, very much shorter. If here's the average for the long-beaked bugs, the short-beaked bugs' average is much, much, much shorter. They don't need a long beak. It's actually, long beak would be harmful for them to get nutrients out of the small fruit. So those are evidences, those are cases of observable evolution within just a few lifetimes. Secondly, there's anatomical and molecular evidence. So things called homology. Homology, when we look at the structure of, say, the forearms of different species, homological similarities. So all of these forelimbs are called homologous structures. They have the same internal anatomical structure but different uses. So we can see the layout of the humerus, radius, and all the carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges in all of these species are present, but they use that appendage for something different. These anatomical or homological similarities are artifacts of a common ancestor. This body plan has developed very, very, very long ago, ancient in the past, and has remained unchanged despite the different modifications those appendages got via evolution for these organisms to adapt to their environment. There are molecular similarities, so like we talked about last time, comparing amino acid sequences and DNA nucleotide sequences, we can see similarities between different organisms that harken back to common ancestors. And developmental or embryological similarities. Fish and reptiles and birds and humans in early development all develop gill slits where gills would be. And humans and birds, those gill slits turn into the larynx and parts of the upper respiratory system. But in fish and reptiles, well, some reptiles like amphibians, they remain there. Why is that? Because both fish, reptiles, birds, and humans all a long time ago had common ancestors that had gill slits or that breathe underwater. Same thing, we humans develop tails, just like birds and reptiles and fish, except the tails disappear later in development. And that's because earlier we had an ancestor that had tails. There's also vestigial structures, so structures that in ancestors would have been useful, but in the recent species aren't, much like the pelvis and femur bones in whales. Whales evolved from a land animal, a land mammal, and these vestigial hip, pelvis, and femur bones are still artifacts of that ancestor. There's convergent evolution. What convergent evolution is organisms that aren't necessarily close related have evolved to look alike because they have faced similar environmental pressures. So fish, sharks and dolphins are, one's a fish, one's a mammal, aren't very closely related evolutionarily, but they look similar because they both live in a similar environment and face similar evolutionary pressures. This is why a lot of organisms that convergently evolved have things called analogous structures. Or appendages that look the same or look different but are used for the same thing, like a bee wing or a bird wing or a bat wing. They all, or a pterodactyl ring, they all look similar, or they all are used for the same thing, but they have an underlying structure that is different. So analogous structures have an underlying structure that is different, but they are used for the same thing, and analogous structures are evidence of coevolution. Or convergent evolution, sorry. The fossil record supports evolution, so the gradual increase in complexity over time. Also, between rock strata, we never see organisms from down here end up in rock strata up here, or ones up here end up down here. There is a linear relationship between the development of species and their fossils and time. We've found many examples of intermediate species on the way between an ancestor and different branching off points. One of the great examples is Homo sapiens. We've seen many steps in between the evolutionary ancestor and the common modern species. And lastly, biogeography is a big piece of our support for evolution. Something that didn't escape Darwin. He noticed the similarities of different species between disconnected places. For example, here, the ostrich in Africa, and the rhea in South America, the emu in Australia, and the kiwi in New Zealand, and the Kosovar, can't even pronounce that name correctly, I'm sorry, in New Guinea. They all have similar morphologies, share common ancestors, and they do, and that is explained by the fact that back during the Pangeal era, all of these areas were connected. They were connected with a common ancestor. And as different populations of that ancestor migrated, the Pangeal mass broke apart into South America, Africa, Australia, and the different Australian islands, and they were isolated from each other. And so they could accumulate genetic differences by variation specific and adaptation to their specific environments. So that's an introduction, kind of a review of Darwinian evolution, and we'll continue with that in class on Monday.